Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. Today we will be learning about K-12 funding for schools in the United States. Let's get into it. So here's our agenda. First of all, we're going to talk about the different types of K-12 schooling, and then we're going to spend the majority of the presentation talking about public schools and how they get their money. Because the majority of children go to public schools, it has the most complex funding system. And so essentially we're going to spend the whole majority of the presentation talking about that, and we are going to wrap up by talking about some of the problems with the funding system we have here in the United States for public schools. So first of all, here's the different types of schools. You got public, private, and homeschooling. The majority of kids, as I said, go to public school. 49.6 million American children attended public schools in the fall of 2022. Private schools, you have less than 10% of the registration numbers of public schools, right? 4.7 million children in the fall of 2021, so it's a distant second place, and homeschooling is in last place. 3.1 million children were homeschooled in fall of 2021. Public schools get their funding from three primary sources, which we will talk about shortly. Private schools are primarily funded through student tuition fees, donations, and religious organizations. The majority of, but not all, private schools are sponsored or run by or associated with some kind of religious organization. And homeschooling, of course, is funded solely by the children's parents. Good luck to them. So let's talk about funding for public schools. So here's some numbers for you. Federal funding provides 8.3% of revenue for public K-12 schools. State provides 47% and local 44.8% of public school revenue. Now, here's something to keep in mind. These are just average numbers across the United States. These numbers vary from state to state and from year to year. For example, during COVID, the federal government provided a lot more money to schools. They provided, on average, over 10% of public school revenue, but usually federal funding provides less than 10%, right? And in some locations, local government might provide more than state, or vice versa. These numbers are just averages. So let's talk a little bit about how the federal government provides funding to local schools. So one of the biggest way the federal government does this is through grants, and they use formula grants primarily. Formula grants are monetary awards given to public schools based on a predetermined formula and are non-competitive. Schools do not have to fight and compete for this money, it's just given to them. These grants are administered by the Department of Education. Title I grants are given to schools with high percentages of low-income families. The funds support extra instruction and served 24.6 million students in 2016 to 2017. And another big one here is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act grants, or IDEA grants. They provide funding to support students with disabilities, another major source of funding. Now here's another way the federal government provides money to schools. Child nutrition programs contribute greatly to federal funding for public education. 38 billion USD was spent on nutrition programs in 2022. Now, these programs vary in their scope, but typically what they do is they provide subsidized meals to students in one form or another. These programs are administered by the USDA's Food and Nutrition Service and include things like the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, Special Milk Program, and a laundry list of other programs as well. Interesting thing to note about this is that most of this funding is provided in the form of per meal cash reimbursements that states distribute to schools and institutions. Another interesting thing to note about federal funding is that the IDEA grants, the Title I grants, and child nutrition programs make up a very large chunk of federal funding for K-12 education. Now let's talk about school funding on the state level. So first of all, the state has to get money from somewhere. Revenue sources include personal and corporate income tax, sales tax, state lotteries, and excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco. Of course, income and sales taxes are the two biggest categories. And if you live in a state like Nevada, where we don't have an income tax, then obviously sales tax is going to be the biggest one. But in other states, it can be flip-flopped. So once the state has this money, the way it distributes it is primarily through a bunch of different programs. They have foundation programs, full state funding, flat grants, district power equalization, and categorical grants. Kind of like with the federal government, these are just a bunch of different programs the state uses to give money to local educational agencies and ultimately to local public schools. Now, the state government attempts to equalize these resources across all local educational agencies, and funding is targeted at a per pupil spending level, meaning they attempt to target, we're going to spend X amount of dollars per pupil. Now let's talk about school funding at the local level. So those LEAs, those local educational agencies, they can either raise revenues themselves, being fiscally independent, or acquire their funding through the county or city, being fiscally dependent. Those state funds from all those programs are combined with local funds at the level of the LEA. The LEA will then manage the funds and assign resources to individual schools. So the LEA is essentially the financial manager and the judge of which schools get what funds. Now, talking about those local funds specifically, property taxes are the primary source of funding. According to U.S. Census Bureau data from 2016, 72% of all local government tax revenues were from property taxes, with smaller amounts from income taxes, sales taxes, vehicle taxes, and other miscellaneous. So the point here is that a location with low property values will have a harder time funding their schools than an area with high property values, because those property taxes are percentage based on the value of the property. If you have properties that aren't worth very much, there's going to be much less revenue at the local level. Now, state and federal governments can try to equalize things a little bit, right? Like you have those Title I grants, for example, but remember, federal funding is a relatively small portion of all public school funding. If your local government can't raise very much money through property taxes, it's going to be very hard to fund these schools. Speaking of inequality, various sources of funding means obviously variable funding, right? You have all these different levels of government providing funding, and it's never completely equal. Now, states may try to equalize money across LEAs, but each state spends a different amount of money on its students at the end of the day. And once again, this is further exacerbated at the local level with the problem of property taxes. You get what you pay for. So we have this beautiful little graph here. I made it myself. This is average spent per pupil in thousands of USD. So here's some numbers for you. Idaho spends the least money per pupil in the nation at $9,390 per student. Nevada is 45th. We are the 5th worst in the country at $12,230 spent per pupil, and it really shows. California is about middle of the pack. They spend $18,020 per pupil, and New York leads the nation by far at $33,440 spent per pupil. Clearly, every state spends a vastly different amount of money on their schools. Something to keep in mind if you're thinking about moving somewhere. So let's just summarize what we learned today. So there are 3 different types of schooling. You can have public, private, and homeschooling. Public funding is provided on 3 levels of government. Federal funding is through grants and nutrition programs primarily. State funding is through income and sales taxes primarily. Local funding is largely through property taxes. LEAs manage and distribute these funds to individual schools, and massive disparities in funding exist between states and localities. And that's all I have for you. Here are my references. I hope you learned something, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.